The alien planet of Ryloth was a land of unrelenting storms and jagged peaks, a place where strength ruled and the weak were cast aside. King Zarian sat upon his throne of obsidian, the weight of an empire pressing heavily on his shoulders. His people, hardened by centuries of war and conquest, demanded a leader who embodied their values: power, resilience, and dominance. Yet, as Zarian gazed at the holographic image of his only child, he felt an ache that even his battle-scarred heart could not dismiss. Princess Kelith was not like the other heirs of Rylotha's royal lineage. Her body was fragile, her steps hesitant. Born prematurely under the shadow of an eclipse, she had always been viewed as a disappointment, a blemish on Zarian's otherwise untarnished legacy. The council had urged him for years to name a more suitable successor, a warrior from one of Rylotha's noble families. But Zarian could not bring himself to cast her aside. She was his daughter, his blood, and yet he knew she could not survive the brutal world awaiting her without intervention. Zarian's advisors, ever practical and ruthless, suggested exile. A princess unfit to rule was a liability, one that could fracture the empire's fragile unity. But Zarian, though pragmatic, was not without imagination. If Kelith could not rise to the expectations of Ryloth, perhaps she could be remade elsewhere. A solution had come to him in the form of a distant transmission from an unlikely source: a human soldier from the planet Earth. Marcus Kane, a celebrated war hero, had gained notoriety across the galaxy for his unconventional methods and unyielding discipline. If anyone could transform Kelith into a figure worthy of respect, it was this human. The arrangement was made swiftly. Zarian's emissaries contacted Marcus, who now lived in isolation after retiring from a life of battle. Initially, the human had been dismissive, reluctant to involve himself in alien politics. But the promise of substantial compensation, coupled with the unique challenge of training an alien princess, eventually swayed him. Zarian respected the human's reluctance. It mirrored his own reservations about this gamble. But desperation often demanded bold moves. When the day came for Kelith's departure, Zarian did not meet her in the Grand Hall, as tradition dictated. Instead, he stood alone in the shadows of his private chambers, watching the shuttle ascend through the turbulent skies. He felt the sting of regret, but steeled himself against it. This was not just for her. It was for the survival of their empire. On Earth, Marcus Kane waited at the agreed-upon landing site, a desolate expanse of desert far from human civilization. The transport shuttle descended with a low hum, its sleek design contrasting sharply with the rugged terrain. As the ramp lowered, Marcus observed the figures emerging from within. First came Commander Thax, a towering Rylothian warrior clad in ceremonial armor, his posture radiating disdain for the human before him. Behind him, Kelith hesitated at the edge of the ramp. Marcus's first impression of the princess was underwhelming. She was diminutive compared to Thax, her pale features framed by a cloak that seemed to engulf her slender frame. She moved cautiously, her gaze flitting between Marcus and the barren landscape, as though searching for an escape route. It was clear she had never set foot on a planet like Earth before. Commander Thax approached Marcus, his expression a mixture of contempt and skepticism. "King Zarian trusts you, human," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "But know this. If you fail her, there will be consequences." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I don't fail," he replied, his tone devoid of bravado, yet heavy with conviction. He looked past Thax to Kelith. "Let's get one thing straight. I don't care who your father is or what your people expect of you. While you're here, you follow my rules." "Understood." Kelith hesitated, then nodded, though her posture betrayed her unease. Thax stepped closer, his presence looming. "If you harm her—" "She's not going to survive if I go easy on her," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "You sent her here because she's weak. My job is to change that." Thax's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. With a final glance at Kelith, he turned and reboarded the shuttle, leaving the princess alone with her new mentor. As the craft ascended into the sky, The sound of its engines faded, leaving only the wind and the weight of unspoken tension. Marcus gestured for Kellett to follow him to his vehicle, an old but reliable transport designed for Earth's harsh environments. She climbed in awkwardly, her movements betraying her unfamiliarity with the technology. Marcus said nothing as he started the engine, letting the silence stretch between them. He had learned long ago that words meant little without action, and he wasn't about to waste time reassuring her. The journey to Marcus's compound was uneventful, save for the occasional question Kellett posed about Earth's alien landscape. Her voice was soft, almost timid, but there was a curiosity beneath her fear that Marcus noted with mild interest. It was a small spark, but it was something to work with. When they arrived, Marcus led her to a modest building surrounded by an expansive training ground. The facility was stark and utilitarian, designed for one purpose: transformation. "This is where it begins," he said, gesturing to the training area. "You're not a princess here. You're a trainee. That means you'll work, fight, and bleed like anyone else." Kelletha's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. Marcus stepped closer, his tone softening just enough to catch her off guard. "Your father believes you can do this. I don't. Not yet. But if you're willing to put in the work, I'll make sure you leave here stronger than you ever imagined." For a moment, Kellett simply stared at him, the weight of her father's expectations and her own insecurities pressing down on her. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, she agreed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Marcus turned to begin her orientation, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. King Zarian's gamble was a bold one, but Marcus knew the real challenge lay ahead. He didn't care about alien politics or royal legacies. What mattered to him was the girl standing in front of him, a fragile yet determined figure who might just surprise them all. The first morning on Earth greeted Kellett with a sharp chill in the air and the sound of Marcus's voice cutting through the haze of her restless sleep. She stumbled out of the small barracks assigned to her, blinking against the rising sun. Marcus stood waiting, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasted no time. "Day 1 starts now," he said, gesturing toward the sprawling training ground. "You'll either adapt or you'll break. Either way, no excuses." The training began brutally. Marcus introduced her to a grueling series of drills designed to push her body to its limits. Earth's gravity weighed on her like an invisible anchor, making every movement sluggish and exhausting. Kellett faltered within minutes, collapsing in the dirt as her lungs burned and her muscles screamed for relief. Marcus watched her without pity. "Pain is your new companion," he said. "Get used to it." As the days stretched into weeks, Kelletha's struggle became a constant. Each sunrise brought new challenges. Sprinting across uneven terrain, lifting weights that felt impossibly heavy, and learning to wield primitive earth weapons. Marcus left no room for weakness, barking orders and demanding more from her than seemed humanly or alienly possible. At times, it felt like punishment rather than training. Yet, through the haze of exhaustion, Kellett began to notice changes. Her steps grew steadier, her balance surer. The aches in her body became dull and familiar, like old scars she had learned to carry. Marcus was not alone in his efforts. Sergeant Bryce, a grizzled veteran who had served alongside him during Earth's final wars, joined the training sessions. Where Marcus was cold and methodical, Bryce was sarcastic and brash, his sharp wit cutting through the tension like a blade. "This princess needs more than muscle," Bryce said one afternoon as he watched Kellett stumble through a combat drill. "She needs instincts. Right now, she's thinking too much. That'll get her killed." Marcus ignored the comment, but Bryce's words stayed with him. He had seen it, too. Kelletha's hesitation, her tendency to overanalyze every move. It wasn't just her body that needed reshaping. Her mind needed to be sharpened as well. That evening, Marcus approached Kellett as she sat slumped against a training post, sweat dripping from her brow. "You're holding back," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You think too much about what might go wrong. Out here, Hesitation is death. Trust your instincts. Keleth met his gaze, her exhaustion clear, but something else flickering in her eyes, frustration, perhaps, or defiance. I don't have instincts like yours, she said, her voice trembling. I was never meant to be a warrior. Marcus crouched in front of her, his expression softening for the first time. Neither was I, he admitted, but I learned. So can you... The turning point came during a night training exercise. Marcus had set up a scenario in the nearby forest, where Keleth was tasked with navigating through a series of traps while evading Bryce, who played the role of an enemy combatant. The darkness was oppressive, the sounds of Earth's wildlife alien and unsettling to her. She moved cautiously, her every step accompanied by the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of the wind. When Bryce ambushed her, Keleth froze, her mind racing with possibilities. She fumbled for the blunt staff she had been issued, her hands trembling. Bryce closed in, his footsteps deliberate, his mocking laughter cutting through the silence. "Come on, princess," he taunted. "Show me what you've got." Something inside her snapped. The fear that had always paralyzed her was replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Without thinking, she lunged forward, her staff connecting with Bryce's side. The impact sent him staggering back, a look of surprise on his face. Keleth didn't stop. She pressed her advantage, striking again and again until Bryce raised his hands in surrender. When the exercise ended, Marcus found her sitting by the edge of the forest, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. He sat beside her, silent for a moment before speaking. "That's the first time I've seen you fight like you mean it." Keleth didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet but steady. "I didn't think. I just moved. That's what I've been waiting for," Marcus said. "Instincts. They're in you, whether you believe it or not." The next day, Bryce greeted her with a grudging nod. "Not bad, princess," he said. "I'll admit, you've got potential." The training intensified after that. Marcus began teaching her strategy and tactics, forcing her to think several steps ahead in simulated battles. Bryce worked on refining her combat techniques, his gruff humor making the grueling sessions more bearable. Slowly but surely, Keleth began to transform. The frail girl who had arrived on Earth was fading, replaced by someone stronger, someone who could endure. But the challenges didn't stop at the training ground. One night, as the trio prepared for another exercise, a shadow moved in the distance. Marcus reacted instantly, his weapon drawn. From the darkness emerged two figures clad in sleek armor, their alien forms unmistakable. Assassins, sent from Ryloth to eliminate Keleth before she could become a threat. The fight was swift and brutal. Marcus and Bryce worked in unison, their years of experience evident in every calculated move. Keleth, though terrified, refused to cower. She grabbed a weapon from the ground and joined the fray, her strikes clumsy but determined. When the last assassin fell, Marcus turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This is what you're up against," he said. "They won't stop until you prove you're not the weak link they think you are." That night, as the three of them sat around a fire, Bryce broke the silence. "You held your own out there," he said, his tone uncharacteristically sincere. "Still a long way to go, but not bad." Keleth didn't reply, but a small, determined smile played on her lips. For the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could become the warrior her father needed her to be. Marcus watched her from across the flames, a glimmer of hope in his otherwise hardened eyes. The princess was changing, but the road ahead was still long, and he would make sure she was ready for whatever lay at the end of it. Weeks turned into months, and Earth's unforgiving landscape became Keleth's crucible. Each grueling day in Marcus's compound stripped away the remnants of her fragile past, reshaping her into someone neither Marcus nor her father could have fully anticipated. The frail girl who had arrived on Earth struggled no longer with its gravity or its dangers. She had learned to endure and to overcome, but Marcus knew her greatest test was still to come. As her training neared its conclusion, Marcus introduced a new element to her regimen: live combat scenarios. These were no longer the carefully controlled drills she had grown accustomed to, but brutal simulations designed to push her beyond the brink. Bryce, always eager for a challenge, played the role of her opponent, his experience and raw strength making him a daunting adversary. The first session was a disaster. Bryce overwhelmed her with ease, his strikes landing before she could react, his taunts cutting deeper than his blows. "You're still thinking like a princess," he said, shoving her to the ground for the 5th time. "Out here, that title means nothing." Kelita's frustration boiled over, her fists clenching at her sides. "I'm trying," she snapped, the anger in her voice catching even Bryce off guard. Marcus, who had been observing from the sidelines, stepped forward. "Trying isn't enough," he said coldly. "You think your enemies will care about your effort? They won't. They'll kill you if you hesitate." Again, she rose, her body battered, but her resolve unbroken. The next bout began, and though Bryce still had the upper hand, Kelith fought back with a ferocity that surprised them both. Her movements were sharper, her strikes more calculated. She was learning, adapting. And for the first time, Marcus saw a glimmer of the warrior she could become. The turning point came during an ambush simulation deep in the forest. Marcus had taken her and Bryce into the wilderness under the guise of a simple tracking exercise. Unbeknownst to Kelith, he had arranged for a team of his old comrades, hardened human soldiers, to act as opposing forces. When the attack came, it was sudden and relentless. The soldiers emerged from the shadows, their weapons firing stun rounds that lit up the night like flashes of lightning. Kelita's instincts took over. She moved through the chaos with a precision she hadn't realized she possessed, dodging incoming fire and taking cover behind a fallen tree. Bryce barked orders, but Kelith no longer needed his guidance. She assessed the battlefield quickly, identifying weak points in their attackers' formation. With a burst of speed, she broke from cover, disarming one of the soldiers with a swift strike before using his weapon against his allies. Her movements were fluid, almost instinctive, and by the time the ambush ended, she stood victorious amidst the stunned soldiers. Marcus stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You're starting to understand," he said, his voice low. "But battles aren't just won with skill. They're won with purpose. Why are you fighting, Kelith? What drives you?" She hesitated, the question catching her off guard. For so long, her training had been about survival, about proving she wasn't the weakness her father's empire believed her to be. But as she looked at Marcus and Bryce, at the team she had begun to trust, a new understanding dawned on her. "I fight because I can," she said finally. "Because I must. For myself, for my father, and for those who can't." Marcus nodded, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Then fight like it matters." As her final test approached, the atmosphere in the compound grew tense. Marcus had received word from Ryloth. Assassins were on their way. Kelita's father had anticipated this. Her rise posed a threat to the council factions that sought to unseat her family. The assassins would not wait for her return. They would come to Earth, seeking to eliminate her before she could claim her place. The night of the attack came without warning. Marcus, Bryce, and Kelith were preparing for another exercise when the perimeter alarms blared. The assassins struck swiftly, their sleek forms blending seamlessly into the shadows. They moved with lethal precision, their weapons designed to incapacitate and kill. Marcus and Bryce fought with the experience of seasoned soldiers, their coordination honed by years of battle. But it was Kelith who truly shone. She met the assassins head-on, her staff and blade moving as extensions of herself. Every strike she delivered was deliberate, every movement calculated to exploit her enemy's weaknesses. The fear that had once gripped her was gone, replaced by a calm determination. In the chaos, Bryce was cornered by two assassins, their blades flashing in the dim light. Kelith saw his peril and acted without hesitation. She closed the distance between them in seconds, disarming one assassin with a deft twist of her blade before driving her weapon into the other's chest. Bryce, momentarily stunned, gave her a brief nod of thanks before returning to the fight. When the final assassin fell, silence descended upon the compound. Kella stood amidst the carnage, her chest heaving, her weapon slick with alien blood. Marcus approached her, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "It's done," he said simply. "You've proven yourself." But Kelleth knew her journey was far from over. She had survived, yes, but survival was only the beginning. The assassins were a warning, a reminder of the challenges awaiting her on Ryloth. She looked at Marcus, at Bryce, and at the compound that had become her crucible. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. Marcus nodded. "Then it's time for you to go back. But remember this. The fight doesn't end when you leave this planet. It only changes." As dawn broke over the horizon, Kella stood at the edge of the compound, her gaze fixed on the shuttle that would take her home. She was no longer the frail princess who had arrived on Earth. She was something else entirely, a warrior forged in fire, ready to face whatever lay ahead.